Chapter 16. In the afternoon our judge came over and introduced himself. He told us he'd be going with us that night. About sundown we piled in our buggy and drove a few miles downriver. I noticed other hunters doing the same thing. Everyone was trying to get away from the already hunted territory. It was dark by the time Grandpa stopped. I untied the ropes for my dogs. Little Ann reared up at me and whined. Old Dan walked off a few yards, stretched his body, and dragged his claw through the soft bottom soil. Opening his mouth, he let out one loud bawl and then disappeared into the thick timber. Little Ann was right on his heels. We took off after them. Grandpa got nervous. He said to me, "Don't you think you ought to whoop 'em to 'em a bit?" I told him to wait a little while. There'd be plenty of time for whooping. He snorted and thought a hunter always whooped to his dogs. "Well, I do, Grandpa, but not before they strike a trail." So we walked on. Every now and then we'd stop and listen. I could hear the loud snuffing of old Dan. Once we caught a glimpse of little Ann as she darted across an opening that was bathing in moonlight. She was as silent as a ghost and quick as a fleeting shadow. Pa said, "Well, it sure is a beautiful night for hunting, guys." The judge said, "Oh, you can't beat these Ozark Mountain nights for beauty. I don't care where you go." Grandpa started to say something, and his voice was drowned out by the bell-like cry of little Ann. In a whisper, I said, "Come on, Dan. Hurry up and help her." As if to answer to my words, his deep voice hammered its way up through the river bottoms, and I felt the blood tingling in my veins. That wonderful feeling that only a hunter knows crept over my body. Looking over at Grandpa, I said, "Now you can whoop." Jerking off his hat, throwing back his head, he let out a yell. It wasn't a whoop or a screech, it was halfway zip betwixt, and everyone laughed. The coon was running upriver towards our campground. We turned and followed. I could tell by the dogs' voices they were running side by side and were hot on the trail. Closing my eyes, I could almost see them running, bodies stretched out to their fullest length, legs pounding up and down in white steam, rolling from their hot breath in the frosty night. Grandpa got tangled up in some underbrush and lost his hat and spectacles, and it took us a while to find the glasses. Pa said something about getting them wired on with baling wire, and Grandpa snorted and the judge laughed. The coon crossed the river and ran on upstream, and soon my dogs were out of hearing distance. I told Pa we'd better stay on our side of the river and keep going until we could hear them again. 20 minutes later we heard them coming back, and we stopped. I think they crossed back to our side," I said. All at once, the voices of my dogs were drowned out by a loud roar. "What in the world was that?" Grandpa said. I don't know," the judge said. "Reckon it was wind or thunder." About that time, we heard it again. The judge started laughing. "I know what that is. Those hounds have run that coon right back by our camp. That noise we heard was the other hunters whooping up to them." Everyone laughed. A few minutes later, I heard my dogs bawling treed. On reaching the tree, Pa ran his hand back under his coat and he pulled out Grandpa's gun. "Well, that's a funny-looking gun," the judge said. "That's a 410 gauge pistol, is it?" "Well, it's the very thing for this kind of work. You couldn't kill a coon with it if you tried, especially if you got bird shot. All it will do is sting his hide a little." At the crack of the gun, the coon gave a loud squall and jumped. My dogs lost no time in killing him. We skinned the coon, and soon were on our way again. The next time my dogs treed, they were across the river from us. Finding a little riffle, they pulled off our shoes, and we started across. Grandpa, very gingerly, started picking his way. His tender old feet moved from one smooth rock to another. Everything was fine until we reached midstream where the current was much stronger. Well, he stepped on a loose round rock, and it rolled, and down he went. As the cold river water touched his body, he let out a yell that could have been heard for miles. He looked so funny we couldn't help but for laughing. Pa and the judge helped him to his feet. Laughing every step of the way, we finally reached the other side. Grandpa kept going on in his wet clothes until he reached the tree where the dogs were. After killing the coon, we built a large fire so Grandpa could dry his clothes. He'd get up as close to the fire as he could and stand this way and that. And he looked so funny standing there in his long underwear steaming away. I started rolling with laughter. He looked over at me and snapped.
"What's so blasted funny?"
"Nothing."
"Well, then why are you laughing?"
At this remark, Pa and the judge laughed until their eyes started watering. Mumbling and grumbling, Grandpa said,
"Well, if you fellers were as cold as I am, you wouldn't be laughing."
We knew we shouldn't be laughing, but we couldn't help ourselves. The judge looked at his watch.
"Well, it's after 3 o'clock. Do you think they'll tree another one?"
As if to throw the words back in the judge's face, old Dan opened up, and I stood up and whooped.
"Woo-wee! Get 'em, Dan, get 'em! Put 'em in a little tree."
There was a mad scramble, and Grandpa tried to get his britches on backwards. The judge and Pa ran over to help him with his shoes. Each one of them tried to put a shoe on the wrong foot, and I was laughing so hard I couldn't do nothing. 100 yards from the fire, I realized we had forgotten the coon skins, and I ran back for them. My dogs had jumped the coon in swampland. He tore out for the river bottoms, and I could tell they were close to him by their fast bawling. All at once their baying stopped. We stood and listened. Old Dan bawled tree a few more times and stopped.
"What happened?"
Grandpa asked. Well, I told him the coon had probably pulled some kind of trick. Coming up with my dogs, we could see they were working up and down an old rail fence, and we stood and watched. And every now and then, old Dan would rear up on a large hackberry tree that was standing about 7 feet from the fence and bawl treed. As of yet, little Ann had not bawled the tree bark. We watched her. She was working everywhere. She climbed up on the rail fence and followed its zigzaggy course until she disappeared into the darkness. I told Pa I was sure the coon had walked that rail fence, and in some way they'd fooled my dogs. Old Dan would keep coming back to that hackberry tree. He would rear up and bawl treed. We walked up to him. We looked in the tree over. We could see that the coon wasn't in it. The judge says,
"Well, looks like he has them fooled." "Maybe you better call him off," Grandpa said. "We can go someplace else and hunt. We gotta get one more coon, even if I have to tree it myself."
Well, for some reason, no one laughed at his remark. "Well, it's almost daylight, Billy," Pa said. "Yeah, that's what has me worried. We don't have any time to do any more hunting. If we lose this one, we're beat." Hearing the word beat, Grandpa began to fidget.
"What do you think happened? How do you figure the coon fooled him?"
"I don't know for sure. He must have walked that rail fence. That hackberry tree has something to do with his trick, but I don't know what yet."
"Son, I wouldn't feel too badly if I was you. I've seen some of the very best hounds fooled by a smart old coon."
Regardless of all this discouraging talk, the love and belief I had in my little red hounds never faltered. I could see them now and then, leaping over old logs and tearing through the underbrush, sniffing and searching for that lost trail. My heart swelled with pride. I whooped and urged them on. And in a low voice, the judge said,
"I'll give 'em one thing. They don't give up easy."
Birds began to cheep all around us, and the sky took on a light gray color. The tiny, dim stars were blinking the night away. "Well, looks like we're beat. It's getting to be daylight," Pa said. And at that moment, the loud, clear voice of a red-boned hound bawling treed ran through the river bottoms. It was the voice of little Ann. Sucking in a mouthful of air, I held it. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. I closed my eyes tight and gritted my teeth to keep the tears from coming.
"Well, let's go get him," Grandpa said. No, just wait a minute, I said. Why? He said. We wait until old Dan gets there. It's daylight now, and if we walk up to that tree, the coon might jump out. It's hard to keep a coon in a tree after daylight. Let's wait until old Dan gets there. Then if he jumps, he won't have a chance to get away. Well, the boy is right, the judge said. It is hard to keep a coon in a tree after daylight.
Just then we heard old Dan, his deep voice shattering the morning silence. Searching for the lost trail, he had crossed the fence and worked his way out into the old field. Turning around, we saw him a-comin'. He was a red blur in the gray morning shadows. Coming up the trail fence, and without breaking his stride, he raised his body into the air. About halfway over, and still in the air, he let out a bawl. Hitting the ground with a loud grunt, he ran past us, and everyone gave him a whoop. Ahead was a deep washout, about 10 foot wide, and on the other side was a canebrake. His long red body, stretched to the fullest length, seemed to float in the air as he sailed over, and we could hear the tall stalks rattling as he plowed his way through. A bunch of sleepy snowbirds rose from the thick cane and flitted over and settled in a row on the old rail fence. Nearing the tree, we could see it was a tall sycamore, and there in the high top was a coon. Grandpa threw himself a fit. He hopped around whooping and hollering. He threw his old hat down on the ground and jumped up and down on it. Then he ran over and kissed little Ann right on the head. After we killed and skinned that coon, the judge said, "Let's walk back to that old fence. I think I know how that old fella pulled his trick." Back at the fence, the judge stood and looked around for a few minutes, and smiling, he said, "Yeah, that's how he did it." "How?" Grandpa asked. Still smiling, the judge said, "That old coon, he walked this rail fence, and coming even with that hackberry tree, he leapt up onto its side, then climbed up. Notice how thick the timber's up there. See that limb way over there in the top, that one that runs over and almost touches that sycamore?" Well, he saw what he meant. That coon walked out onto that limb, leapt over and caught that sycamore limb. And I repeated this over and over from tree to tree, and he worked his way far out into the river bottom. What I can't figure out is how that hound found him. Gazing at little Ann, he shook his head and said, "I've been hunting coons and judging coon hunts for nigh on to 40 year, and I ain't never seen nothing like that." He looked over at me. "Well, son, you've tied the leading teams. There's only one more night of eliminations. Even if some of them get more than 3 coons, you'll still be in the running. And from what I've seen here, you got yourself a good chance at winning that cup." I knew that little Ann had scented the coon in the air, same as she had the ghost coon. I walked over and knelt down by her side. The things I wanted to say to her, I couldn't, for the knot in my throat, but I'm sure she understood. As we came into the campground, the hunters came out of their tents and gathered about us. The judge held up the 3 big coon hides, and there was a roar from the crowd. One fellow shouted, "Well, that's the most beautiful sight I ever seen." "What was a beautiful sight?" Grandpa asked. "Last night, those little red hounds brought that coon right through camp." The judge said, "We figured that's what they must have did when we heard that noise." Laughing, the man said, "We heard them when they was running up on the other side of the river. Way up above here they crossed over. We could tell they were coming back, so we doused out all the fires, and sure enough, they came right through camp. Those 2 little hounds couldn't have been 50 yards behind that coon, running side by side. And boy, they were picking them up and laying them down, bawling every time their feet touched the ground. I tell you, that's the prettiest sight I ever saw." When the judge started telling about the last coon little Ann had treed, I took my dogs over to her tent and fed and watered them. After they'd had their fill, I gave them a good run-down with a piece of gunny sack. Taking them out to the buggy, I tied them up, and I stood and watched while they twisted around in the hay making their bed. That night I tried to get some sleep in our tent, but the soaking Grandpa had taken in the river had given him a cold and causing him to snore. I never heard such a racket in all my life. I'd have sworn he rattled the paper sacks in our grocery boxes. Taking a blanket, I went out to my dogs. Little Ann had wiggled up close to old Dan as she could. Prying them apart, I lay down between them and fell asleep. The last night of eliminations turned out like the second night. None of the judges turned in more than 2 hides. That day, about noon, the owners of the other winning teams and I were called for a conference with the head judge. He said, "Gentlemen, the eliminations are over. Only 3 sets of hounds are left for the runoff. The winner of tonight's hunt will receive the gold cup, and if there's a tie for the championship, naturally there'll be another runoff." He shook hands with each of us and wished us good luck. Tensions began to build up in the camp. Here and there hunters were standing in small groups talking. Others could be seen going in and out of tents with rolls of money in their hands. Grandpa was the busiest one of all. His voice could be heard over all camp. Men were looking at me, talking in low tones, and I strutted like a turkey gobbler. That evening, while we were having supper, a hunter dropped by. He had a small box in his hand. He said, "Everyone agreed that we should have us a jackpot for the winner. I've been picked to do the collecting." Well, Grandpa said, "Well, you might as well just leave it here now." Looking at me, the hunter said, "Son, I think almost every man in this camp is hoping you win it, but it's not going to be easy. You're going up against 4 of the finest hounds there are." Turning to my father, he said, "Did you know those 2 big Walker hounds have won 4 cups already?" Very seriously, Pa said, "You know, I have 2 mules down at my place. One is almost as big as a barn, and the other one ain't much bigger than a jackrabbit. But that little mule will outpull the big one every time." Smiling to the hunter, as he turned to leave, he said, "You could be right." Pa asked me again where I thought we should start hunting. Well, I'd been thinking about this all day. I'd said, "Remember where we jumped that last coon in the swamp?" "Yeah." "Well, the way I figure it, more than one coon lives in that swamp. It's a good place for them to be with lots of crawfish and minnows in those potholes. If a hound jumps one of them, he has a good chance to tree him." "Why's that, Billy?" "Well, it's a long ways back to the river and about the same distance to the mountains. Either way he runs, a dog can get pretty close to him, so he'd have to take to a tree pretty quick." That evening we climbed into Grandpa's buggy and headed for the swamp. It was dark by the time we reached it. Grandpa handed Pa his gun, saying, "Well, you're getting to be a pretty good shot with that thing." "Well, I hope to do a lot of shooting tonight," Pa said. And under my breath, I said, "I do too." After untying the ropes for my dogs, I held onto their collars for a minute, and pulling them up close, I knelt down and whispered, "This is the last night. I'll know you do your best." They seemed to understand, and tugged at their collars, and when I turned them loose, they started for the timber. Just as they reached the dark shadows, they stopped, turned around, and stared straight at me for an instant. The judge saw that strange action. Laying a hand on my shoulder, he asked, "What do they say there, son?" "Nothing that anyone could understand, but I can feel they know this hunt is important. They know it just as well as you and I." It was little Ann who found the trail. Before the echo of her sharp cry had died away, old Dan's deep voice floated out of the swamp. "Well, let's go," Pa said eagerly. "No, let's just wait a minute again," I said. "Wait, why?" "Well, we want to see which way he's going to run." The coon broke out of the swamp and headed for the river. Listening to my dogs, I could tell they were close to him, and I said to Pa, "I don't think he's going to make the river. They're right on his heels." By the time we circled the swamp, they were bawling treed. The judge said, "Boy, that was fast." Well, I felt my father's hand on my shoulder, and looking at me, he smiled and nodded his head.
Pa and I knew I had judged that coon perfectly. He didn't have time to reach the river or the mountains. My dogs had treed that coon in a tall ash which stood about 50 yards from the river. I knew that 50 yards had saved us a good hour because he could pull trick after trick if he had gotten into the water. We spied the coon in the topmost branch. At the crack of the gun, he ran far out on the limb and jumped. He landed in an old fallen tree top, and he scooted out through it, and coming out on the other side, he ran for the river. The tangled mass of limbs slowed my dogs, but they all but tore the treetop apart getting out of it. And the coon was just one step ahead of them as they reached the river, and we heard them hit the water. Running over, we stood and watched the fight. The coon was at home in the river. He crawled up on old Dan's head, trying to force him under. Before he could do it, little Ann reached up and pulled him off. In a scared voice, Pa said, "That water looks deep to me." "Well, maybe you better call them off," said the judge. "That's a big coon, and he could drown one of them easily in that deep water." "Call them off? Why, you couldn't whip them off with a stick. There's no use for anyone getting scared. They know exactly what they're doing. I've seen them do it more times than one." Grandpa was excited and scared. He was jumping up and down, whooping and hollering. Pa raised the gun to aim. I jumped and grabbed his arm. "Don't do that! You'll hit one of my dogs." Yelling round and round in the deep water, the fight went on. The coon climbed onto old Dan's head and sank his teeth into one of his long, tender ears. Old Dan bawled with pain, and little Ann swam in and caught the coon by one of the hind legs in her mouth. She tried hard to pull him off, and all three disappeared under the water, and I held my breath. The water churned and boiled. All three came out from the top about the same time. The coon was between the bank we were standing on and my dogs, and he swam towards us. They caught him again just as he reached shore, and he fought his way free and ran for a large sycamore. Old Dan caught him just as he started up, and I knew that was the end of the fight. After it was all over, and the coon had been skinned, Grandpa said, "I hope we don't have to go through that again. For a while, I'm sure I thought your dogs were goners." The judge said, "Well, have you ever seen that? Look over there." Old Dan was standing perfectly still with eyes closed and head hanging down. Little Ann was licking at his cuts and bleeding ears. "Well, she always does that. If you'll watch, when she gets done with him, he'll do the same for her," I said. We stood and watched until they finished doctoring each other, and then, trotting side by side, they disappeared into the darkness. We followed along, stopping now and then to listen. End of chapter 16.